Hey guys, Shouldoge here. Today we are looking at Matrova's BalanceX, Aussie, and Rascal. Matrova has been around as an OEM for around 5 years now, but didn't start releasing mouse pads under the Matrova branding until early January of 2025. The BalanceX is supposed to be Matrova's take on the Artisan Zero, and in my opinion, is the closest feeling and play-wise of any other Artisan Zero alternative I've tried to the Zero. Though Matrova says the BalanceX is supposed to be slightly faster. The Rascal is supposed to be a very smooth and controlled surface option, similar to the Shadow Hunt, but a level more balanced than that surface. The Aussie is one of Matrova's more unique surfaces, with a feel-textured, balanced control surface with a very cloth-like surface feel. I got all the pads featured in this video from the Matrova website, which the BalanceX was actually a mistake on Matrova's part, as I was supposed to be receiving a Breeze V2 when I was sent this BalanceX instead. My circumstances were very specific though, so if you do order from Matrova, you're much less likely to have this issue, and they did reimburse me for the troubles. It is worth mentioning at this point in the video that if you are located in the US, I would only buy Matrova's pads from the Project W store, whether that be the pads in stock or from the custom group buy if available, for reasons of which I will iterate more on later in the video. Now, with that being said, moving on to the surfaces, starting with the BalanceX. Looking at a macro shot, the BalanceX has a moderately tight, maybe on the looser end of tight surface weave. That does seem to have some inconsistencies in tightness, with some threads appearing to poke out more than others. I don't see any fraying, but it does surprise me how the surface of the BalanceX feels so similar to the Artisan Zero, with how different the properties are on the surface weave, and with the weave being tighter, I would have expected it to be slower than the Zero despite Matrova's claims of the opposite. As I stated earlier, the BalanceX feels very similar to the Artisan Zero, with a light coarse texture when moving across, of which the texture becomes more scratchy and influential on the frictional properties when you begin to press down more. For me, the properties of this surface pair nicely with the PU mid-base, as I don't find myself ever struggling to come to a stop when avoiding the harsh texture that can come with this kind of surface and a softer base. Now, as for a comparison, seeing how much I've mentioned the Artisan Zero throughout this video, it would feel wrong for me not to do a comparison between the two. When I initially first tried the Matrova BalanceX, I thought it was hands down the exact same as the Artisan Zero, but after a good amount of testing, there are some minor differences between them worth noting. I think the biggest difference that comes to the top of my mind is that the surface of the BalanceX does feel a bit smoother than the Zero, in the sense that it feels a bit less natural or more artificial, but not in a bad way. While Matrova themselves do insist that the BalanceX is a small bit faster than the Zero, I struggle to find this myself, as they feel nearly identical in terms of frictional properties. Now, moving on to the properties of the BalanceX, the static and dynamic frictional values of the BalanceX are very balanced with one another. As suggested by the name, if I were to go out on a limb, I would say that maybe the dynamic friction is a bit stronger than the static friction, but I could see it going either way from person to person, and you can likely alter the frictional values by choosing a different base. So if you want something that feels maybe a bit quicker, choose Matrova's new X-Firm silicone base instead. The stopping power of the BalanceX isn't super strong in terms of surface to mouse skate contact, relying much more on the skin contact of the user for controlling your movements. But like the Artisan Zero, there is a good amount of variability in terms of stopping power and mouse skate contact when pressing down into the surface. And for me, I don't ever find myself having to press in any more than what the PU mid-base allows me to come to a stop. There isn't a vast difference in terms of textural difference between the X and Y axis of the BalanceX, but if I were to say, I think the Y axis has a bit less tactility when gliding across than the X axis, but there aren't any huge speed differences here worth noting. Throughout my testing, the BalanceX has handled humidity and sweat alike very well, as I never felt my movements becoming muddy, with either condition becoming more prominent. I would consider the surface of the BalanceX at least sleeve usable, as it works very well with my Kibu Irreversible sleeve, and somewhat well with my Gamer Sups and Unusual Way Sports sleeve, but isn't quite usable enough with any of the other sleeves I own for me to consider it sleeve friendly. The surface of the BalanceX is very easy to keep clean, as with its synthetic smooth surface, I never find myself troubled having to brush debris off of it, and I never find hairs getting caught in it either. And here's an audio test with Magic Ice dot skates on my Logitech GPX2 to show what this texture can sound like. Now, moving on to the Aussie, looking at a macro shot, it's hard to tell what's going on with the surface weave, but from what I can see, it uses a cross weaving pattern similar to the X-ray pad Ace Control, but with a looser and more chaotic look to it, with lots of collective threads bending outward more than others, which I believe gives it the bumpy feel that is so specific to the Aussie. As I mentioned, the Aussie does have a strange feel to it, as the surface weave looks similar to that of the Ace Control, but instead of the surface feeling smoother than its rougher counterparts, the Aussie has a texture to it that I would almost describe as blanket-like. It has a bumpiness that one would find on a way too used cotton shirt, which I'm not fully sold on, as it does create some inconsistencies. With the Aussie being such a unique surface, I just can't say that I have the perfect one-to-one match for it, despite my large collection, but I do think a surface that I believe has a very similar feel and surface properties would be the Crucible V2. Besides the Crucible V2's bumpiness being more inward than outwards, the surface frictional properties of these pads are very similar to one another and are nearly comparable, and I even believe that the PU soft base to be a good comparison to the SR foam that Padsmith uses in their standard series Crucible V2. Now, moving on to the surface properties, the static and dynamic frictional values feel fairly comparable to one another on the Aussie, but another strange property of this pad, despite its texture, is that when more slowly gliding across the surface, the frictional values are moderate to high, but do get a bit lower when gliding quicker across the surface, which makes me feel that this pad is best for flick heavy games and not so much for tracking. In addition to the frictional properties changing, I do feel the texture a good amount more when quickly gliding across the surface rather than slowly tracking, so slow tracking scenarios may not be the best for the Aussie. Due to its rather unique texture, the Aussie does have a very high amount of stopping power even when lightly gliding across the surface, as flicks feel very crisp and snappy on the surface, and despite this, it feels natural, as it never feels like my fingers are getting stuck against the surface when moving. It's hard to find any notable differences in the axes, as each direction feels as controlled as the other, but for some reason, when moving to the right on the x-axis, I do feel a bit more texture than when moving to the left on the same axis. I'm unsure of the exact reason why this happens, but I don't really feel it in game unless I focus on it, and I don't find myself bothered by it, but it does concern me in the overall quality of this pad. I haven't been too bothered by problems involved with a lack of sweat resistance on this surface, but I'm not sure about its humidity resistance with this outward texture that I mentioned earlier, as it feels different from the texture of rougher options, as it almost feels fluffy, like there's places for moisture to get stuck into. I would only go as far as to call the Aussie sleeve usable, as it works with my Clustrs sleeve well enough, but that's pretty much where the usable sleeves on it stop, as none of my other sleeves worked well enough on this surface for me to consider use with them. Despite its unique texture, it has felt easy enough to keep the surface of the Aussie clean, as minor debris brushes off easily enough and I don't find hairs getting caught in the weave at any times. And here's an audio test with Magic Ice dot skates to show what this texture can sound like. Now, moving on to the Rascal, looking at a macro shot, the surface weave of the Rascal is very loose, consisting of rows of very compact threads, with some threads noticeably being more loose than others, though I don't see any fraying anywhere. The surface of the Rascal feels very smooth and soft to the touch, with a slight bit of a sandy feel, different from the marshmallowy feel of other control pads like the Shogun or the La Onda Riz. Testing all the different surfaces I own, to my surprise I actually found the Infinite Control V2 by Infinity Mice to feel the most similar to the Rascal. I do have the Infinite Control V2 in black, which may be worth noting, as I've heard the black version can feel a bit different from the colored versions, and comparing these pads to one another, they are very minimal differences to be found. The surfaces of both of these pads really have what I could only feel to be one-to-one frictional properties, though if I were to say the Infinite Control V2 does just feel a tiny bit smoother against the skin, in the sense that it feels easier to slide across even with sweatier hands. Now, moving on to the surface properties, the static and dynamic frictional values on the Rascal feel fairly similar to one another, with a generally controlled feel while still maintaining a smoothish start. If I were to go out on a limb, I would say that the static friction maybe feels a tiny bit stronger than the dynamic friction, as I do feel a snappiness when switching from one direction to another during dynamic tracking. The Rascal doesn't have a super high stopping power with the PU soft base I have with it, but the PLR base that is paired with the Rascal by default may give the surface a much higher stopping power, especially when you begin to press into it, as the PU soft or mid base that Matrova uses is very thin and doesn't feel super easy to press into. There is indeed a difference between the X and Y axis on the Rascal, with the Y axis feeling a tad more sandy than the X axis, as the X axis feels much more smooth, but the surface overall still does feel very smooth to slide across despite this factor. Unfortunately, I can't say the Rascal is the most sweat resistant, as I feel a prominent stickiness on my fingers when I begin to feel the slightest bit of moisture, and this could be due to the PU soft base that I paired with it. I would hope that it's the same sweat resistance with any base. The humidity resistance, on the other hand, could be give or take, as I don't have the best environment to test humidity, but from what I've felt, moisture has dispersed fairly well on the surface, so I would assume it at least has some humidity resistance. I would say the surface on the Rascal is sleeve usable, as it works decently well with my Clustrs and Pulsar sleeves, though there is still minimal dragging on either one, and it doesn't work well enough with any of the other sleeves I own to recommend any of them. The surface of the Rascal feels easy enough to keep clean, as debris brushes off fairly easy, but I do find that hairs can get caught in the surface weave, which makes sense with how loose the threading is. And here's an audio test with Magic Ice dot skates to show what this texture can sound like. Now, moving on to the bases, both the PU soft and the PU mid consist of a polyurethane rubber and are supposed to be categorized differently depending, as the name suggests, but as I'll discuss soon enough, the differences between these two bases to me are comparable enough to one another. If there's one thing Matrova is known for, their sticky bases might be one of them, and the PU soft and mid do not disappoint, as I find myself struggling sometimes to fully peel these pads off my desk, and even when trying to line them up on my desk properly. To me, these bases are too sticky to the point of being impractical, but if you find your pads moving under your arm, maybe this is your calling. The Rascal and the BalanceX measured 0.1 millimeters within each other, with the Rascal measuring at 3.7 millimeters thick and the BalanceX at 3.8 millimeters when measuring the entire thickness of the pad, but the Aussie on the other hand measured at a whopping 4.5 millimeters thick. Now, getting into the bases and the possible difference between the PU mid and soft, if you're observant enough, you would have probably noticed that there aren't any separate sections in this video for PU mid or soft, and that's because to me these bases feel the exact same. If anything, maybe the PU mid feels a bit slower coming back up rebound wise, but besides that, these bases are way too identical to identify them as two completely separate categories in terms of plushness to me. If I were to give a base that felt similar to the properties of the PU mid and soft bases, I would say the rubber base used in the Zowie GSR or the Alpha Cell base in the Pulsar ES2 feels fairly similar to either of the PU bases mentioned. As I mentioned, the adherence of Matrova's polyurethane bases are very sticky, so much so to the point of being annoying to handle, but it can be appealing to some. And I will admit that I'd rather have an overly adherent base than a base that lacks any adherence at all. While debris can indeed get stuck to the undersides of this pads fairly easily, you can always wash the underside with water to make it stick like new if needed, or if you're lazy, you can just spray a bit of water between the base and the surface you're laying it on top of to give it a temporary boost of adherence. While the elasticity on the PU soft and mid feel very comparable to one another, as I mentioned earlier, the only noticeable difference I can find between the two would be that the PU mid may feel a bit slower coming back up rebound-wise, but neither of them are too plush to the point where any kind of dot skates become unusable with these pads, but it may be worth noting you could potentially run into issues with the Aussie if you use thinner mouse skates with its protruding texture. The stitching pattern that Matrova follows is very similar to that of the LGG standard series. It does mesh with the base and isn't fully stitched on the bottom, as you can see each thread poking out. The stitching on all of the surfaces shown today feel very firm compared to the rest of the base, especially on the Aussie, but despite this, I do feel that the stitching on all pads do level out nicely with the rest of the surface when pressing down on them. The stitching on all Matrova pads are nicely below the surface, and I don't feel my mouse cross over the edge with dot, donut, or full skates at all. Now, moving on to quality, none of the surfaces shown in this review are coated, and none of them feel any different to when I first received them. I don't feel any muddy spots or places where the speed of any of the surfaces changes otherwise. The printing quality on both the Rascal and the Aussie are very nice, though I would say the Rascal came out especially clean, but I do have some concern for the Aussie with the surface weave properties and some lines and corners not being as sharp compared to the Rascal. There isn't any big discretion I could find with how Matrova describes each surface versus how it actually performs, but maybe the Aussie is a bit more controlled than how Matrova has it placed, as I find it comparable if not slower than the Scarlet. You can choose whether or not to include the Matrova logo on each surface for custom pads, and if you do, it will be printed onto the surface rather than stamped on top, so you won't feel your hand or mouse cross over it at all. While the surface weave alignment isn't perfect on the Rascal or BalanceX and it's hard to tell with the Aussie, I don't believe I'd actually run into any issues with the surface weave alignment with any of these pads, as Matrova never gets far enough in that regard for it to have any impact on performance. Moving on to the quality of the base, nearly all of the pads mentioned, including the Aussie and the BalanceX, feel perfectly flat all the way around the surface, but the Rascal does have a very noticeable bump near the top left edge of the pad, which you can easily see and feel when gliding over it. All of the surfaces come very close to the listed size that I ordered them in, with the biggest deviation coming from the Rascal, with the x-axis measuring 1/3 of a centimeter shorter than the 50 centimeters length specified. Both the PU soft and PU mid bases feel the same plushness all the way around the pad, but it is worth mentioning that there can be some discrepancy depending on how tight the surface weave is. For example, the Breeze in PU Soft will feel much more firm from the surface than the Rascal in PU Soft. Moving on to stitching, the stitching is pretty even on all of the surfaces, and I don't have the same issue with the corners being overstitched nearly to the same degree that I used to with Matrova's pads. The implementation for where the stitching meets is very clean on all of the surfaces in this video, and I do think that Matrova has only gotten better over time with its stitching implementations, as it meets at the top left corner on all of the surfaces, which you can hardly run into, and looks very clean visually speaking without taking up much distance. None of the pads in this video have begun to fray near the bottom edges where I've been placing and moving my arm around, and I have no concerns for its durability in the future, as it doesn't begin to fray when I scratch it either, though there are some pieces of the base that you can see sticking out every now and then, which may raise some concern for durability in the future as far as that goes. Moving on to customer service, Matrova's customer service doesn't disappoint this time around either, as they are always ready and willing to answer any questions you may have, whether asking on their website, their Discord, or even their Twitter. Every time I had a problem with the Surface or had some feedback about quality, it felt like my opinion was worthwhile, though there are some issues worth highlighting in terms of shipping that I'll talk about soon. Matrova is very active on its Twitter, sometimes even hosting giveaways, and regularly responds to posts about Matrova's pads. Their Discord is also quite active and has a very kind team working to make it a great place for everyone, while still maintaining somewhat of a sense of professionalism around their products. The purchasing experience itself was easy enough, as I bought all of the pads in this video directly from Matrova's website. However, shipping and tracking is a different story, as it has been incredibly frustrating for US customers to receive their pads due to how Matrova sends their pads through the US customs. Not to say it's all Matrova's fault, of course, as the CEO did explain to me that it's more of a con of making custom pads, as they'd have to dedicate an entire warehouse in the US if they were to try and improve customs here. A great alternative to this problem would be to buy from Project W, which I will list in the description, as they ship from the US and they have a decent selection of default Matrova surfaces to choose from, and even host a custom group buy every now and then for custom pads as well. Now, moving on to price, each of the pads I shown in this video came to $42 or $46 including shipping, depending on if you get it in the 490 by 420 or 500 by 500. And it will cost an extra $6 if you get it in the silicone base. Each pad came packaged rolled up in a new box for Matrova packaging, including a much more durable outside, with a nice bag that pads are put inside of. None of the pads came with any other accessories, and Matrova does indeed make some very nice budget custom pads, and I do love just how specific you can get with them. So I would say they are very much so worth the price, especially if you aren't resided in the US and can order it directly from Matrova's website. In conclusion, I would recommend the Rascal to someone who is looking for a smooth, comfortable, controlled experience, the Aussie to someone who is looking for the best surface possible for flicking scenarios, and the BalanceX to someone who has either never bought a Matrova pad or is looking for the most balanced surface while still maintaining a fair amount of texture. I would rate these pads as follows, with the BalanceX being a 87 out of 100, the Aussie being an 83 out of 100, and the Rascal being an 82 out of 100. I would certainly buy from Matrova again, and am especially excited for their Zafiro pad that should be coming out sometime in 2025 if we're lucky. With that being said, thanks so much for watching. Bye bye.